The summer of 1789 lay over Charleston like damp funeral crepe, salt-thick air clinging to skin, mosquitoes whining their slow benedictions over the marsh. In the low country, where the Ashley and Cooper rivers braided themselves into the Atlantic, the wind brought 2 scents that year: the honest reek of indigo vats and the sweeter, more dangerous perfume of gossip. The war had ended 6 years earlier, but its ghost still walked these streets in boots that never learned to be quiet, and in houses where widows counted ledgers by candlelight because there were no men left to do it for them. Rosewood Plantation stood 17 miles north of town, a white-limbed house above tidal fields that glittered like scales under the Sunday. On a Tuesday near the end of August, a maid found Margaret Elizabeth Langdon face down across the desk in her study. The shutters were drawn. The room smelled of paper and lemon oil and the faint iron taste of the river. Her skin had turned the color of storm water, her lips a blue seam. A quill lay by her rigid hand, the ink long since hardened to a black tear. Dr. Cornelius Havelock was sent for Havelock with the damp jowls and the gentle voice merchants trusted because it charged them more. He stood over her briefly, did not so much as unbutton a cuff, and pronounced yellow fever with a sorrowful nod that cost 10 shillings. No one argued. Fever was scripture here. It could lay a household quiet in 3 nights and leave the silver polished and the chairs empty. But what sent Charleston into a fever of its own came 3 days later, when the study door opened again and men who smelled of tobacco and entitlement took their places in rows. The drapes wore mourning black. Outside, cicadas poured their old, relentless hymn. Attorney Jonathan Pembroke, a thin man whose spectacles seemed too heavy for his face, broke the wax seal on a packet resting where Margaret's hand had fallen. The wax held the shape of a rose, pressed so deep it looked fresh cut. He cleared his throat. "The last will and testament of Margaret Elizabeth Langdon," he read, and a dozen cousins leaned forward on their polished shoes like hounds noting a scent. Pembroke's hands trembled. He adjusted his glasses and continued, voice scraping at the quiet. "I, being of sound mind and failing body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, Rosewood Plantation, its lands, livestock, and holdings to Samuel, born of unknown parentage, who has served this house with dignity, kindness, and a mercy I have found nowhere else in this world." The silence that followed was not reverence. It was the silence of a blade being drawn. A chair shrieked across floorboards. Thaddeus Langdon, ruddy-faced, already sweating through his collar, lurched to his feet. "This is madness," he barked. "She's left Rosewood to a slave." "A freedman," Pembroke said quietly, though the words had almost no breath. "Manumitted in 87. The papers are recorded in Charleston." "Freed or not, he's colored." Thaddeus spat. "She has spat on her blood, her name, and the almighty order of things. That will is an abomination." Josiah Merrick, a planter from Goose Creek, leaned forward in the amber light, his eyes as flat and cold as a river stone. "You cannot intend to execute this profanity, Mr. Pembroke." The attorney looked down at the page, and if his hands trembled more, so did his voice. "The will is legally sound. Mrs. Langdon was of sound mind." "Sound?" Thaddeus slammed his fist onto the table, cutlery rattling in the next room. "A white woman of station leaves her estate to a Negro, and you call that sound?" She was bewitched or gone with grief. Pembroke did not answer. He had sat across from this woman, counted columns with her, shared tea in this very room. He knew the sharpness of her mind, the way she laughed like a match-head catching, but he also knew what saying so would cost him in this room that smelled of old money and fresh panic. Outside the tall windows, the fields lay domestic and glistening. Indigo rose, rice paddies laid out like mirrors, egrets pacing with priestly patience. Somewhere beyond that bright strip of lawn and the last polite fence, a man worked among the sun-bent stalks with hands that could cradle a newborn foal or split oak with one clean stroke. Samuel had been born on this land 32 years ago, without a mother to remember and without a father anyone would name. An overseer had christened him with the book, because that's what men did when they had no intention of letting a boy write his own name. After Colonel Richard Langdon died at Eutaw Springs, the plantation passed to Margaret, 26, childless, and watched by every eye that expected her to sell quickly or marry quicker. She did neither. She rose before dawn, learned the fields, learned the books, learned which men talked to her and which only talked at her. When she made Samuel foreman 2 years later, Charleston sniffed the air and decided it smelled wrong. But harvest followed harvest, and profit did not care whose hands brought it home. So the town tutted and went back to counting. That is how truth lives here, a thing everyone sees and no one names. At first, their conversations were made of timber and weather, and the geometry of water gates. Then, like a river finding the easier bank, they turned toward books. There were laws against teaching slaves to read. There were no laws against a woman setting a book on a table and leaving the room. In the quarters after lights out, by a candle guttering low, Samuel traced letters with a carpenter's patience, words like beams laid true. He read of crops and philosophers, of laws and their loopholes, of the king dead and the new nation stumbling like a colt. Somewhere under those magnolia shadows, between things legal and things permitted, something moved. Not romance written in the frank hand of poets, this place has never allowed that, but recognition. A steady seeing, a woman born to authority, and a man born to its lash meeting each other on a narrow shelf where the air tasted like choice. In 1787 she took him to Charleston and filed the papers. She paid the fees and came home with a packet that said a person cannot be property. At least, not this person, not today. She handed it to him at dusk, where the river threw fire at the sky. "You're free," she said, and the words hung in the sweet insect. Rich air like a bell that would not stop ringing. "You can leave if you wish." He had looked toward the fields and the quarters and the slow breath of the marsh. "And go where, Miss Margaret?" She made no answer. He stayed. Now, 3 days after her body cooled, a young kitchen woman named Dinah ran through the glare to find him at the paddy's edge. She came breathless, glancing behind her, as if news could follow with teeth. "Samuel," she hissed, "they're coming. Cousins and lawyers and that constable with the stiff hat. Miss Margaret, she left you the plantation. They're calling it blasphemy. They're saying you turned her mind." In the distance, hooves cracked the road like green cane. He did not run. He could have. The tree line lay close as a promise. The river knew 1,000 ways out. But he kept his feet in the mud and watched 3 riders pour up the drive like trouble-given reins. Thaddeus, face lit with the easy righteousness of a man sure the law is his reflection. Josiah Merrick, eyes enjoying the arithmetic of ruin. And the constable from Charleston, badge dull as a winter coin, mouth already forming the apology men wear when they intend to do harm politely. "There," Thaddeus said, as if pointing were a sacrament. "The devil who corrupted my cousin's soul." Samuel's heart thudded against his ribs, but his voice came quiet. The constable tipped his hat as if to a dangerous dog. "Samuel, you'll need to come with us. There are questions about Mrs. Langdon's death, about influence." "I didn't kill her," he said. "Then you won't mind answering questions," Josiah replied, cool as water cut from shade. Across the yard, faces pooled in windows, eyes he had known since childhood. Men who had worked beside him, girls he'd watched become mothers, boys he'd christened with nicknames and secret lessons. He understood with a calm that made his fingers shake that it didn't matter what he said. The world had already decided the shape of his guilt. Margaret had committed the one unforgivable sin of the Low Country. She had seen him as human, and they would bury them both for it. Far to the south, on the wide front steps of Belmay Plantation, Eleanor Ashford stood in the long orange light and watched a thin grey seam of smoke drift up from Charleston. She was 41, with hair pulled back hard and eyes like winter tide. Smoke here meant news, news here meant danger. She did not flinch, but her hands whitened on the rail as if to wring the wood into a warning. Somewhere in the house a clock told a slow, proper hour. The sound carried across the yard, over the quarters, into the fields, where men and women kept working because work was the only thing the sun respected. Back at Rosewood, the constable reached for Samuel's wrists. The iron-kissed skin with that quiet, practiced weight it saves for people it believes it owns. "This is unnecessary," Samuel said. "Yes," the constable agreed sincerely. "All the same." Inside the house draped for mourning, the will sat cooling on the desk like a gun that had just been fired. The wax rose looked almost wet in the heat, as if it were a living thing that might soften and rewrite itself under pressure. It would not. Words like these harden fast. They become the kind of story a country tells itself when it needs a villain, and when it is not brave enough to choose the right one. By nightfall, the lamps in Charleston would bloom, voices would cluster under eaves, a preacher would find a verse to make cruelty sound like duty, a lawyer would find a clause to make theft look like order, and the river, old unbothered witness, would carry all of it to sea. Samuel straightened when the chain tugged. He did not ask for time to pack or prayer to bless him. He turned his face toward the road, and the city that had filed one set of papers to make him a man, and would now consider papers to make him property again. Behind him, the paddies reflected the last shapeless gold of evening, 100 broken mirrors that could not agree on what the sky meant. Somewhere, a whip-poor will called its single, sorrowing question into the trees, and no one answered. They led him away. Morning came to Rosewood with the sound of iron striking wood. Somewhere beyond the main house, someone was repairing a gate, the same creak, the same ring, every few seconds, steady as a pulse. The plantation was pretending nothing had changed. But inside the jail in Charleston, a man sat in a room too small for the years that had made him. Samuel had been there for 2 nights. The cell smelled of rust and river damp, and when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the hum of the paddies, the call of the herons, the laughter that used to drift from the quarters before curfew. Memory, he thought, was crueler than any chain. It made a man taste what he'd already lost. He was not thinking of escape. He was thinking of Margaret. 32 years earlier, Samuel had been born on the floor of a tool shed behind the sugar house, wrapped in a grain sack, named by the overseer because the midwife refused to waste a Bible verse on another child, destined to die before harvest. But he lived. The mistress at the time, Colonel Langdon's mother, allowed him to stay in the quarters nursery. By 12, he was hauling timber. By 16, he could lift a barrel of rice alone. He had no father to name and no mother to remember, but he had his hands and he had silence, and both would serve him better than words. When Colonel Langdon went to war, Samuel worked in the carpenter shed that supplied musket stocks and wagon wheels for the militia. He was there the day the messenger rode up with the letter sealed in red wax. The colonel had been killed at Eutaw Springs. Margaret was 26, and suddenly the mistress of 43 enslaved souls and more debt than she could count. The Low Country planters called it a widow's curse. Too much land, too many mouths, no husband to speak for her. They expected her to fail. She didn't. Margaret learned quickly that grief could be disguised as discipline. She rose before the overseer, walked the fields herself, learned the feel of the soil between her fingers. She took the ledgers from her late husband's desk and read them until the numbers began to make sense. Men laughed quietly, behind gloved hands, but her harvests never failed, and she noticed Samuel. At first, only as strength, a back straight under the sun, hands that could mend a plow faster than the smithy. But strength alone wasn't what made her pause. It was the way he listened to others, to the earth, to the small invisible things that kept a plantation alive. Where most obeyed, Samuel understood, so she made him foreman. It was an act of quiet rebellion, the kind that earned no headlines but changed the air itself. Neighbors whispered. A woman alone was already a scandal. A woman who trusted a black man to run her estate was blasphemy stitched in daylight. But Rosewood thrived. Even the skeptical merchants of Charleston began to admit that Mrs. Langdon had a shrewd head for crops. They meant it as insult. She took it as praise. In the evenings, after the accounts were closed, Margaret sometimes walked the veranda. She'd pause by the stairs that led to the quarter-yard, watch the lamps flicker below like fallen stars. Only once she'd asked him to stay when he came to deliver the day's report. "I want to understand how you measure the irrigation," she'd said, pointing to the sketches in her notebook. "It seems to me the west field floods too soon." Samuel hesitated. "The land there's lower, ma'am, if we raise the gate 2 inches. Show me." He led her down to the trench, the two of them alone in the dusk. The air was thick with magnolia. Fireflies pulsed along the edges of the reeds. She knelt, pressed her gloved fingers into the mud, testing it as he'd shown her. The moment lasted seconds, but afterward it lived between them like a question they would never dare to ask. They began speaking more often after that first, about crops, then about books. Margaret had inherited her husband's library, volumes of philosophy, agriculture, and history stacked like forgotten sermons. She lent him one once, a slim, leather-bound treatise on water control. He returned it a week later, quoting passages from memory. "You read fast," she said. "I listen fast. he corrected, his voice almost shy. "The letters, they tell stories, like the field rose, straight if you keep your line." That night, Margaret sat in her study long after midnight, the open book before her, wondering what would become of a mind like his in a world that refused to see it. The answer came 2 years later. When she placed the manumission papers in his hands, the sun was bleeding out behind the cypress trees. The papers bore the seal of Charleston Court, witnessed, signed, recorded, freedom reduced to parchment and wax. "You're free," she said again. It felt to Samuel as if the words had been carved from something larger than either of them. He looked at the page, then at her. The distance between them was no wider than a breath, and yet the world stood inside it. "And go where, Miss Margaret?" She didn't answer because she didn't know. Freedom, in theory, was a place. In practice, it was a hunger that never ended. He stayed because leaving meant vanishing. At Rosewood, he was seen, if not as equal, at least as necessary. Beyond its borders, he'd be prey. For 2 more years, they worked side by side. They spoke of planting schedules and water levels, of scripture and storms. She laughed less, but when she did, it startled him, bright, real, like the crack of a branch letting in sunlight. He'd never touched her, never crossed that invisible line between command and desire, but every day it felt thinner. Then the fever came. It began in the quarter, took 2 children and a driver. When it reached the main house, she refused to flee to town like the others. "If they die here, I stay here," she said. She wrote letters in those last days, one of them, the will that would burn Charleston to its foundations. Back in the jail, Samuel replayed her voice in his mind, the way she'd say his name softly, without title, without caution. He remembered her handwriting too, the small, decisive loops that never hesitated. He thought of that final act, her last rebellion, and wondered if she'd known what it would cost him. The door creaked. Pembroke stepped inside, hat in hand. "Samuel," he said quietly, "they'll bring you before the magistrate tomorrow. They've made up their minds, but I'll do what I can." "What you can," Samuel repeated, almost smiling. "And what is that?" "Argue the law. Pray it listens." Samuel looked down at his calloused hands, the same hands that had built fences, cradled foals, turned pages by candlelight. "The law doesn't listen, Mr. Pembroke. It talks. We're just the silence between its words." Pembroke swallowed. "Margaret trusted you. She said you were the only one who ever showed her kindness." "She showed me something too," Samuel murmured. "That mercy is louder than chains." Outside, the bells of St. Michael's tolled the hour. The sound crawled down the alleys, into the jail, and through the bars like a reminder that time itself was a luxury some men would never own. Somewhere beyond those walls, the gossip was spreading through parlors, over silver teacups, across the low country, like a fever more deadly than the one that had killed her. They called it time's bewitchment, asterisk. They called it time's blasphemy, asterisk. They called it time's unnatural, asterisk. By dawn, they would call it a trial. Samuel closed his eyes. The world, he thought, had many ways to kill a man. Fever was simply the kindest. The Charleston courthouse stood like a monument to obedience, its white columns rising from cracked stone steps, each one washed in the morning glare of a city preparing for a public spectacle. Inside, the air smelled of limewash, sweat, and judgment. The crowd filled every row of the gallery, planters and merchants fanning themselves, women in black lace whispering scripture through clenched teeth, and at the edges, those who had no right to speak but every reason to watch. The enslaved, the freed, the fearful. At the center of it all sat Samuel, bound in chains. They glimmered faintly in the light that cut through the high windows, a cruel jewelry meant to reassure the white audience that their world remained in order. He did not lower his gaze. Judge Mortimer Caldwell presided, his powdered wig stark against skin, seamed by 67 years of disdain. He had sentenced men to hang, women to destitution, and children to the auction block without ever raising his voice. To him, this was not a trial. It was maintenance, one more hinge to oil on the great door of Southern law. "This court," he intoned, voice heavy as marble, "convenes to determine the validity of the will and testament of the late Mrs. Margaret Elizabeth Langdon." He paused, eyes sliding to Samuel, "and the alleged undue influence upon her person." The word times influence times rippled through the room like a match tossed into dry grass. Attorney Silas Whitmore rose for the prosecution. A man built for performance, his coat pressed to perfection, his spectacles gleaming, his voice ringing out with the ease of one who never doubts the righteousness of his cause. "Your Honor, good people of Charleston," he began, "we gather not to insult the dead, but to defend the living from deceit, from disorder, and from the decay of moral law." He turned, pointing at Samuel as though he were summoning a ghost. "There sits the man who calls himself Samuel, a Negro born in bondage, raised in servitude, who wormed his way into the graces of a Christian widow until she forsook her family, her station, and her God to bestow upon him all she possessed." A hum of satisfaction rolled through the spectators. Whitmore paced, letting the silence fatten before striking again. "We will show, through testimony and evidence, that Mrs. Langdon was unwell in mind and spirit, that she was manipulated by cunning, by witchcraft of persuasion, by the dark arts of guilt and seduction, to sign away her estate. And we will show that this, Freedman, the word slithered from his tongue, is nothing less than the serpent in our midst." Pembroke rose for the defense. His face was pale, his voice strained but steady. "Your Honor, the law of this colony of this state declares that any property owner of sound mind may dispose of their estate as they see fit. Margaret Langdon was lucid, capable, and deliberate. Her choice may offend the prejudices of men, but it offends no statute." Judge Caldwell nodded. "Proceed." Whitmore called his first witness, Dr. Cornelius Havelock. The physician waddled to the stand, wiping sweat from his jowls. "You attended Mrs. Langdon before her death?" "I did," Havelock replied, settling into the chair as though performing a sacrament. "She was frail, given to fevers and," he paused delicately, "fancies." "Fancies?" Whitmore prompted. "She spoke of equality, of the souls of slaves being equal to those of their masters." The doctor shook his head with practiced sorrow. "Such notions are contrary to scripture and reason. I deemed her mind unsound." Pembroke leapt up. "Objection. Personal belief is not medical diagnosis." "Sustained," said the judge without warmth. "Dr. Havelock, restrict yourself to physical symptoms." But the words were already loose in the room. Unsound. Equality. Contrary to scripture. The crowd didn't need law, they needed language to justify their hate, and Havelock had given it to them. Next came the cousins, each more indignant than the last. They spoke of Margaret's unusual behavior, her unnatural fondness for the foreman, her habit of walking the fields alone and allowing Samuel to speak to her as if he were an equal. Each accusation was greeted with murmurs of disgust, as if decency itself were on trial. Finally, Whitmore called a servant from the main house, a woman trembling so violently she could barely hold her hand to the Bible. Her testimony came haltingly, under threat she didn't dare name. Mistress, she would speak kindly to him, said he had good sense, gave him books. Whitmore's smile was thin as paper. "Books," he repeated for the gallery. A white woman teaching a Negro to read. Gasps bloomed like mold. When the prosecution finished, the air in the room had curdled. Pembroke rose, and though his hands trembled, his words cut clean. "You have heard conjecture, not proof. You have heard gossip dressed as law, but a will, witnessed and sealed, remains legal. Margaret Langdon was not bewitched. She was brave." He turned to Samuel. "The defense calls the beneficiary, Samuel, to testify." The courtroom erupted, a freedman taking the stand against white accusers, blasphemy in oak and marble. Whitmore barked protest. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "He is a free man," Pembroke countered. Judge Caldwell hesitated. He loathed the precedent but worshipped the letter of the law. "Technically permissible," he said. "Proceed." The bailiff led Samuel to the stand. The chains were removed for the oath, though his wrists still bore their ghosts. He laid a rough palm on the Bible. "State your name." "Samuel." He paused, then added softly, "No other name." Pembroke began gently. "How long did you serve the Langdon estate?" "All my life, 32 years. "And what was your duty?" "I managed the fields. I settled disputes. I kept the work fair." "Did you ever compel or persuade Mrs. Langdon to alter her will?" "No, sire." Did she ever speak of affection toward you? Samuel hesitated, the hush of 200 breaths pressing against him. She treated me with respect, he said finally. She spoke to me as if you were what? Pembroke urged. Samuel's eyes lifted, steady as the tide. As if I were a man. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the flies seemed to stop their circling. Whitmore recovered first. Mr. Samuel, he said with mock politeness, after your manumission, you remained at Rosewood. Did Mrs. Langdon pay you wages? No, sir. So you lived on her charity, her favor. Whitmore turned to the crowd. Tell us, what did you do to earn such times favor asterisk? Did you provide her services beyond your station, perhaps in her private chambers? Objection, Pembroke thundered. Withdrawn, Whitmore said with a serpent's grin. The damage was done. Laughter rippled cruelly through the gallery. Samuel said nothing, but his silence was not surrender, it was armor. He had lived long enough to know that truth meant little to men who mistook cruelty for virtue. For 3 days, they picked his life apart. The hours he kept, the meals he ate, the way he looked at his mistress when she spoke. Each word they twisted until mercy became manipulation, and humanity, heresy. When the verdict came, it fell like a stone dropped in a well. This court finds, Judge Caldwell declared, that Mrs. Langdon, though once of sound mind, was in her final months under undue influence and diminished capacity. Her will is void. The estate of Rosewood shall pass to her legal heirs. He turned to Samuel. Your manumission will be reviewed. Until its legitimacy is confirmed, you are remanded to custody. A roar surged through the crowd, cheers, curses, triumph. The gavel struck wood again and again, but law was no longer speaking, vengeance was. As the bailiff led Samuel through the side door, the shouts followed him down the corridor like hounds. In the gallery, 3 women sat apart, veils drawn. Eleanor Ashford, Catherine Beaumont, Lydia Crane. They did not meet one another's eyes. They had all testified, they had all lied. And as the noise echoed off the marble walls, each of them felt something heavy settle into her chest, something that would not leave, not for years. Outside, the bells of St. Michael's tolled again, clear and relentless, as if the city were proud of what it had done. On the courthouse steps, a boy sold lemonade to the gentlemen who had come to watch justice performed. They laughed, sipped, and spoke of harvests. And the wind from the harbor carried the scent of salt, sweat, and the faintest trace of indigo, the color of both profit and mourning. Evening settled over the low country like a bruise. The sun sank into the marshes, staining the sky red where it touched the horizon. By the time the last light died, every widow from Georgetown to Savannah had heard the story. Charleston's telegraph was gossip, its wires made of tongues. At Belmay Plantation, Eleanor Ashford sat alone on the veranda, her teacup gone cold. She was a woman carved out of control, hair drawn tight, voice always precise, a survivor of the war who had learned that power in a woman must never look like feeling. But tonight her hands would not stay still. The cup rattled against the saucer as the maid stepped forward with a letter, her head bowed low. From Mrs. Beaumont, ma'am, the girl said. Eleanor broke the seal, read the short, shaking lines by lamplight. Asterisk, we must meet tonight, at Willowmere, before it spreads further. Asterisk. She folded the paper with care, but her jaw tightened. Tell Isaiah to saddle the carriage, she said. Isaiah appeared within minutes, broad-shouldered, grey at the temples, his expression as composed as hers. He had been her foreman for 12 years, the quiet spine of Belmay. When Captain Ashford died at Yorktown, it was Isaiah who had kept the plantation breathing. The two had learned to speak in the language of necessity, the work, the land, the accounts. But beneath those words lived another grammar, a loyalty neither dared to name. You're going to Willowmere? He asked. Yes, she said. It's dangerous, he replied. After what happened to Rosewood, tongues will be wagging. They'll watch every move. Eleanor hesitated. Then let them watch. Willowmere Plantation, Lydia Crane's estate, sat on a rise overlooking the river, its white walls ghostly in the moonlight. By the time Eleanor's carriage rolled up the drive, 2 others were already there. Catherine Beaumont's pale blue coach waited beside the magnolia trees, lanterns flickering inside like trapped fireflies. Lydia herself opened the door. At 53, she was the eldest and most deliberate of them, her silver hair coiled in perfect order, her posture as unbending as the cane stalks that lined her drive. Come, she said without greeting. "We haven't much time." Inside the parlor, the air was close with brandy and the scent of burning paper. A small fire crackled in the hearth. Beside it, a tin tray filled with ash. Eleanor saw the charred corners of letters, recognizable handwriting now reduced to smudges. "Whose were they?" she asked. "All of ours," Lydia said. "Correspondence, journals, anything that might tie us to Margaret." Catherine sat near the window, her face half hidden in the shadows. She was the youngest, barely 34, and her beauty was the fragile kind that cracked under scrutiny. She stared down at her hands, knotted in her lap. "She's gone," Catherine whispered, "and they've made her a cautionary tale." "They've made her an example," Lydia corrected. "One they intend to repeat if we aren't careful." Eleanor's voice cut through the air, low but sharp. "Careful? You think we can burn our way out of this? The whole city is talking. They're calling it a contagion, a sickness of sympathy, and they'll trace it back here." Catherine looked up, her eyes glistening. "Because we met. Because we dared to speak of things we weren't meant to." Lydia poured 3 glasses of brandy and handed them out like communion. "Then let's speak of them one last time, before silence finishes what the court began." It had started 5 years earlier, in the quiet aftermath of war. The husbands were dead, the sons scattered, and the plantations left to women who were supposed to be ornamental. They found one another out of necessity, a network of widows navigating the ruin of a man's economy. They met discreetly, once a month, rotating homes to avoid suspicion. What began as a fellowship of survival became something else, an unspoken confederacy of thought. They discussed ledgers and labor, crops and contracts, but also loneliness, how the world expected them to bear loss with grace and gratitude, as if widowhood were a virtue. Margaret had been the boldest among them. Eleanor could still see her now, sitting by the fire, her face lit by the flames, her voice trembling with confession. Asterisk. "He's not like the others." Asterisk, she'd said once, staring into her cup. Asterisk. "He listens. When he looks at me, he doesn't see what's expected. He sees me." Asterisk. Lydia had said nothing that night, though she'd understood. Each of them had someone who made the silence less unbearable. For Catherine, it was Caleb, the foreman who'd kept Harrow Hill from collapse. He was brilliant with the fields, quiet with his strength, and too careful to ever forget the danger of being seen. For Lydia, it was Josiah, grey-haired, deliberate, a man of 60, whose wisdom had steadied her through the worst years. And for Eleanor, it was Isaiah. He had never crossed a line, but there were evenings when their conversations drifted dangerously close to honesty. They all knew the boundaries. They also knew how easily boundaries dissolved in grief. Now, as the fire crackled, the 3 women stood in a room thick with ghosts. "Margaret was a fool," Eleanor said finally. "She was brave," Catherine whispered. "She was reckless," Lydia countered. "Bravery and recklessness are often mistaken for one another. You saw what the court did to Samuel. You saw what the crowd did." "I saw men afraid," Catherine said, her voice rising. "Afraid of what it means when we see the people we own as people. That's all this is, a fear of seeing." Eleanor set her glass down hard enough to make it ring. "And fear kills faster than fever, you know that. You both do." Silence spread between them, heavy and suffocating. Outside, the river murmured, carrying away the ashes that had been Margaret's letters. At last Lydia spoke. "We'll deny everything. If anyone asks, we knew her only in passing. We call her unstable. It's cruel, but it's survival." Catherine looked ill. "You want us to call her mad?" "I want us to stay alive," Lydia said. Eleanor nodded slowly, though her throat burned with the taste of brandy and shame. "She's already dead," she said. "Our loyalty won't bring her back, but our silence might keep the rest of us breathing." The fire spat sparks onto the hearth. Catherine rose suddenly, crossing to the window. Moonlight silvered her face, her youth, her terror. "Then may God forgive us," she whispered. "Because the world won't." Lydia turned away, gathering the last of the letters from her desk drawer. The paper caught flame, curling into black petals. Eleanor watched the fire devour their secrets and thought of Margaret's will of that wax rose pressed deep into the parchment. A rose, she thought, that refused to die quietly. By dawn, the 3 widows went their separate ways. At Belmay, Eleanor stood on her veranda, watching the first light bleed across the paddies. Isaiah was waiting at the steps, hat in hand. "Was it as bad as you feared?" he asked. She stared past him at the horizon. "Worse," she said, "because it's not over." And somewhere beyond that horizon, in the cells of Charleston, Samuel waited for judgment that had already been passed. The city would call it justice, the widows would call it warning, and history, when it finally caught up, would call it the beginning of a reckoning. Charleston awoke to judgment. The courthouse steps were slick with humidity and expectation, the square already choked with carriages by dawn. Merchants abandoned their stalls, clerks their ledgers, and even the street preachers postponed their sermons. There were more souls to save inside the courtroom today. By 9 o'clock, the gallery was full. Gentlemen in creased linen, their wives fanning themselves with church programs, and behind them, the enslaved and freed alike pressed against the walls, silent and watchful. It was not merely a hearing, it was theater. A morality play designed to remind every soul in South Carolina what happened when order was challenged. Samuel entered between two bailiffs. His wrists were shackled again, though he offered no resistance. The crowd leaned forward as if to confirm that he was flesh and not myth, a man, not the demon whispered about in Charleston parlors. His gaze did not waver, though his shoulders carried the weight of every eye in the room. At the defense table, Jonathan Pembroke looked exhausted. He had not slept. The ink on his notes was still wet. Opposite him, Silas Whitmore stood poised like a conductor before an orchestra of outrage. Judge Caldwell struck the gavel once. The sound cracked through the air like thunder. "This court is reconvened in the matter of times, Langdon versus the state of South Carolina *", he said. "We shall hear arguments regarding the legitimacy of Mrs. Langdon's will and the influence exerted upon her by the man known as Samuel." Whitmore rose, his voice measured and theatrical. "Your Honor, esteemed gentlemen, and the righteous people of Charleston, this case is not about parchment or property. It is about purity. It is about the fragile thread of order that binds this society together. When a woman of breeding falls under the influence of a Negro, when she confuses charity with affection and affection with temptation," he paused, letting the word coil in the room, "then the very soul of our civilization trembles." He turned, gesturing to Samuel. "The defendant stands as proof that freedom, when granted without guidance, becomes corruption. He is a freed man, yes, but can a freed slave ever be truly free of his baser nature, or of the malice that envy breeds?" The room murmured approval. Fans fluttered like nervous wings. Whitmore smiled faintly. "We will show that Mrs. Langdon's so-called will was not the act of sound reason, but the final delusion of a woman bewitched by her own misplaced compassion." Judge Caldwell inclined his head. "Proceed with your witnesses." Whitmore called Dr. Cornelius Havelock once more. The physician waddled to the stand, dabbing at his brow. "Doctor," Whitmore began, "describe the state of Mrs. Langdon's health in her final months." "Grave," Havelock replied. "Her body weakened, her mind distracted. She spoke often of freedom, of equality between races. She rejected the advice of her peers. It was as though fever had taken her reason long before her flesh." "Would you say she was susceptible to suggestion?" Havelock nodded solemnly. "Most certainly, particularly from those she favored." Pembroke rose. "Objection, speculation, overruled," said Caldwell, though his tone was weary. The crowd hummed again, the conclusion already written in their faces. Margaret Langdon, once the pride of the parish, was being declared insane not because she lost her mind, but because she found her conscience. Next came the cousins. Thaddeus Langdon stormed to the stand like a man wronged by God himself. "My cousin disgraced us all," he thundered. "She walked among her slaves as though she were one of them. She shared meals with them, read to them, and that man," he jabbed a trembling finger at Samuel, "spoke to her as no Negro should dare. She called him times Mr. Asterisk." Gasps erupted. A woman in the gallery clutched her pearls as if she'd been struck. Pembroke stood. "Mr. Langdon, are you aware that Mrs. Langdon legally manumitted Samuel 2 years before her death?" "I don't care what papers she signed," Thaddeus spat. "A dog may wear a collar of gold, but it's still a dog." Judge Caldwell's gavel struck the table. "That will be enough." But the damage was done. The venom had been released. When Whitmore called his next witness, a young housemaid from Rosewood, the room leaned forward again. The girl's hands shook so violently she could barely hold the Bible. Her eyes darted between the lawyers and the crowd like a trapped bird. "Martha," Whitmore said softly, "did you ever see Mrs. Langdon alone with the defendant?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. sometimes in the study or in the garden. Did she seem herself? I don't know, sir. She smiled more when he was near. And you considered that strange? She hesitated. It weren't the smile of a mistress to a servant. The room erupted. Voices hissed, muttered, cursed. Even Judge Caldwell's gavel could not drown the sound. Whitmore raised his hands theatrically. We need no more words, Your Honor. The evidence is written on every decent face in this room. Mrs. Langdon's will was born of corruption, not compassion. When the prosecution rested, the air was a single, suffocating breath. Pembroke stood slowly, his voice almost hoarse, but filled with steel. Your Honor, may I remind this court that the law does not measure sanity by opinion, nor morality by gossip. Mrs. Langdon's will was witnessed, signed, sealed, and filed in accordance with every requirement of South Carolina statute. It was the act of a woman of intelligence, not delirium. He looked around the room at the faces twisted in certainty and saw there was no winning. Still, he pressed on. Mrs. Langdon's kindness has been mistaken for corruption, her sense of justice for madness. But perhaps it is not she who was unsound, but the world that condemned her for seeing humanity where others refused to. He turned toward Samuel. The defense calls the beneficiary to the stand. A ripple of disbelief coursed through the gallery. Judge Caldwell sighed. The court reminds Mr. Pembroke that while precedent allows such testimony, it must remain within bounds of propriety. Yes, Your Honor. Samuel rose. The chains clinked softly. He stepped to the witness box with the slow grace of a man who had carried weight all his life. State your name. Samuel. No surname. No, sir, never given one. Pembroke nodded. Samuel, tell us of your life at Rosewood Plantation. Samuel's voice was low but steady. I was born there. Worked there all my life. Mrs. Langdon taught me the accounts, trusted me with the fields. I managed the work, kept the peace, saw the harvests through. Did she ever compel you to influence her? No, sir. She was her own mind, always. Did you love her? The courtroom froze. The question was blasphemy. Samuel's breath caught. His hands tightened on the rail. I respected her, he said finally, and she respected me. That's all either of us ever wanted to be seen as people. Pembroke nodded, voice trembling. As people. Whitmore rose for cross-examination, his tone dripping with false civility. Mr. Samuel, he said, you claim to have earned this woman's favor through respect. Tell me, what services did you provide that made her abandon her kin? Was it her crops you tended, or her loneliness? The crowd gasped, half thrilled, half scandalized. Samuel met Whitmore's eyes. I tended what she trusted me with, and I never betrayed it. Yet she rewarded you with her fortune, Whitmore sneered. That is not reward, it is witchcraft. You bewitched her pity and called it virtue. I called it mercy, Samuel said quietly. Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and bright. Whitmore slammed his papers shut. No further questions. The devil needs none. Judge Caldwell's gavel came down again, sharp as gunfire. Order, but the word had no power left. By the time the arguments ended, everyone knew the verdict. The law was merely a mask. The outcome was a performance. At sunset, Caldwell read the judgment. Asterisk, the will of Margaret Elizabeth Langdon is invalidated. The estate shall revert to her family. The freedman Samuel shall remain in custody until further review of his manumission papers. Asterisk. The crowd erupted in applause. As Samuel was led out, he turned once toward the gallery. 3 women sat there, Eleanor Ashford, Catherine Beaumont, and Lydia Crane, faces pale beneath their veils. They did not look at him. They could not. In that moment, Samuel understood that they, too, were prisoners bound by fear, not chains. And that fear, more than iron, was what kept the South in order. Outside, the bells of St. Michael's rang for vespers, their peals drifting over the city like a benediction twisted into mockery. The sound followed Samuel all the way to the jail, fading only when the door shut behind him and darkness took its place. Night fell like judgment over Charleston. Rain began near midnight, soft at first, then relentless, an unending hiss against the windows of every house that had whispered Margaret Langdon's name that day. The courthouse stood silent now, its white pillars gleaming in the wet, as if trying to wash away the sins spoken inside. But no rain could clean what had been done. At Harrow Hill Plantation, Catherine Beaumont lay awake. The sound of thunder rolled through the rice fields, echoing in the channels that her foreman, Caleb, had designed with such care. Each flash of lightning turned the room white for a heartbeat, illuminating the letter that still lay on her desk, the court's verdict, written in precise, pitiless ink. Samuel imprisoned, the will voided. Margaret declared unsound. Catherine turned her face into the pillow, but the darkness had its own memory. She saw again the look on Samuel's face as they chained him, the quiet disbelief of a man who had done everything right and found that rightness was the crime itself. She thought of Margaret's last words, the ones whispered during their final meeting a month before the fever took her. Asterisk. They will call us mad for seeing what they cannot. Asterisk. Now madness had a verdict, and mercy a sentence. Caleb knocked softly at her door. Miss Catherine. She hesitated, then said, "Come in." He entered, dripping from the rain, his shirt clinging to his shoulders, the smell of damp soil following him. He closed the door quickly behind him, lowering his voice. "I came from town," he said. "They've locked Samuel in the jailhouse near the port. They say the papers are being reviewed." "Reviewed," Catherine repeated bitterly. "You know what that means. They're looking for a reason to take his freedom." "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me that," she said, almost whispering. "Not now." He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment neither remembered who they were supposed to be. The space between them felt fragile, dangerous, but familiar. "They'll come here next," he said finally. "The gossip's spreading. They'll say you're no different from her." Catherine's lips trembled. "Maybe I'm not." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Don't say that. I saw how they looked at me in court," she said, voice breaking. "How the women turned away. They think I'm her accomplice. Margaret's disease, her contagion. And maybe they're right, because I sat in that room, and I lied." Caleb stepped closer. "You lied to survive. I lied to bury her." Lightning cracked outside, and for an instant their shadows merged on the wall, the mistress and the man who kept her world from collapsing. "I told them she was confused," Catherine whispered. "That she was grieving, not thinking clearly. I said it so they'd leave me alone, and when they did, I felt relief." She pressed her hands to her eyes. "God forgive me." I felt relief. Caleb reached out, hesitated, then rested a hand on the back of her chair. "You can't change what's done, but you can change what comes next." She looked up. "And what is that?" "They'll come again," he said quietly. "They'll question you, maybe me. We burn everything they could use. Letters, notes, anything that mentions Rosewood or Samuel. If they find a whisper of sympathy, they'll hang it around your neck." Catherine shook her head. "And what about you? You think they'll let a free man like you stand beside me after this? They'll find a way to call your papers false too. That's what they do, they unmake people." He said nothing. There was nothing to say. At Bellamy Plantation, Eleanor Ashford was also awake, but not from guilt, from fury. She stood in her study, staring at the stack of burned letters in the fireplace, the remains of everything she had shared with Margaret, Lydia, and Catherine. Each letter had been written in coded phrases about weather, shipments, and social calls. Yet now they looked like confessions. Her daughter, Abigail, lingered in the doorway. "Mother," the girl said, "the papers came from Charleston. They say Samuel will be sold if the court voids his manumission." Eleanor didn't turn. "That's what they want. They're cleaning house, making examples." Abigail hesitated. "You could speak for him. You knew her. And damn this family. You have no idea what that would mean." "I have every idea," Abigail said. "It would mean doing what's right." Eleanor finally faced her daughter. "What's time's right? Times won't protect you when they come for us next. Margaret thought virtue could save her. Look where it got her. Look where it got him." Abigail's voice broke. "You sound just like them." Eleanor's hand trembled on the edge of the desk. "Then maybe that's how we survive." At Willowmere, Lydia Crane sat in her parlor with a single candle burning low. A knock rattled the door. She didn't need to ask who it was. "Mr. Pembroke," she said as he entered, his coat soaked through. He looked older than he had in court, defeated, hollow-eyed. "Mrs. Crane," he said softly, "I'm sorry to come unannounced, but I have nowhere else to turn." She poured him a glass of brandy. "You think I can help him?" "I think you're the only one left who might try," he said. "You knew her better than anyone." "I denied her on oath," Lydia replied, voice cold. "You heard me. You want me to risk that again?" Pembroke leaned forward, desperation flickering behind his spectacles. They'll sell him before winter. Once he's gone, he'll vanish shipped west or worse. Margaret trusted you. If you ever cared for her, don't, Lydia cut in sharply. Don't make this about sentiment. You think I haven't cared? I cared enough to stay alive when caring could kill me. Alive for what? Pembroke snapped. For silence, for fear. Lydia turned away. Rain hammered the windows. Fear keeps people breathing, Mr. Pembroke. He rose, his voice shaking. It also keeps the gallows busy. When will you realize it's the same noose, just slower? He moved to the door, hesitated. If you change your mind, send word to me. The North still honors manumission papers, even if the South doesn't. I can get him out. When he was gone, Lydia stood for a long time staring at the candle flame. The rain blurred its reflection in the glass like a tear sliding backward. At last she whispered, "We chose survival, Margaret, and it's killing us anyway." By morning, the storm had passed, but the world it left behind was quieter, too quiet, like a room after an argument. On the road to Harrow Hill, a carriage rolled through the wet mud carrying Jacob Thornhill, a neighboring planter known for his righteousness and cruelty. In his hand, a sealed document. Catherine's name was written on it. Inside the envelope, the words weighted like a knife. Asterisk, madness spreads. Control it before it consumes you. Asterisk. The war for Rosewood was over. The war for the widows had just begun. The letter arrived at Harrow Hill just past noon, carried by a servant whose hands shook as he offered it. The seal, red wax stamped with the Thornhill crest, was already cracked from the heat. Catherine Beaumont stood by the window as she read it once, twice, and again, the words cutting deeper each time. Asterisk, Mrs. Beaumont. Reliable sources have brought to my attention certain improprieties regarding the management of your estate and the behavior of certain members of your household. I write only out of Christian duty. It would grieve me to see your late husband's good name diminished by rumor. Address the situation promptly and decisively, lest further action be required. Asterisk. Signed, asterisk, asterisk, Jacob Thornhill, asterisk, asterisk, Moss Creek Plantation. Catherine's hands trembled. The ink seemed to move on the page like living venom. She could almost hear Thornhill's voice in the formal phrasing, a man who hid his cruelty behind piety, who believed his every act of malice was sanctified by God and custom. The threat was clear. They were watching her. Someone, perhaps one of her own servants, had whispered her name, linked her with Margaret's scandal, and now the hunt was coming closer. She folded the letter carefully, slid it into the desk drawer, and locked it. Then she sent for Caleb. He came within minutes, wiping the mud from his boots at the door. Even before she spoke, he could read the fear on her face. "What's happened?" he asked. She handed him the letter. His eyes moved steadily across the page, his expression unreadable until he reached the signature. Then his jaw tightened. "He's bluffing," Caleb said. "Thornhill's always fishing for scandal. It makes him feel righteous." Catherine shook her head. "He doesn't need proof. Not after Charleston. Suspicion is enough." He handed the paper back. "Then I should go." "No," she said quickly. "If you leave now, it'll look like you're running. It'll look like guilt. And staying," his voice was quiet, steady, "that's death. You saw what they did to Samuel." Her heart thudded painfully. "Don't say that. It's the truth. They won't stop with him." She turned away from him, gripping the back of a chair until her knuckles whitened. "I can't lose this place, Caleb. It's all I have left. If they take it, if they ruin me, I'll have nothing." He hesitated. "You'd still have your life." She laughed, a brittle sound. "A woman alone with no name and no land has no life, only gossip." He stepped closer, the distance between them evaporating. "Then come with me." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Catherine looked up. "What?" "Come with me," he repeated. "We'll go north. There are towns where no one asks questions. You could start again." She stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign tongue. "You know what happens to a woman who runs away with a black man? They'll call me worse than mad. They'll hunt us both." "Then let them hunt," he said simply. "Better hunted than owned." For a heartbeat, she almost believed him saw it as he did, the two of them riding north through the night, leaving behind the swamps and the judgment, crossing into a world where names didn't decide worth. But reality came crashing back. "It's impossible," she whispered. "We'd never make it past Columbia." Caleb nodded slowly. Then I'll go alone. She reached for him, gripping his arm. And go where? The moment they stop you, your freedom papers mean nothing. They'll burn them, they'll sell you. He met her gaze. Then at least I'll die on my feet. Her hand dropped. And what of me? He hesitated, the words catching like splinters. I can't protect you if I stay. Catherine's breath shuddered. You already have. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the rain from the previous night dripping from the eaves outside, the cicadas beginning their afternoon hymn. Finally, she spoke. If Thornhill comes, he won't find you. I'll hide you until I can find a way to get you out safely. But you must promise me one thing. What's that? That you'll not do what Samuel did. Don't stay and wait for their mercy. There is none left here. He nodded, but in his eyes she saw something else resolve, the kind that no threat could bend. They didn't have to wait long. By sundown, hooves thundered down the main road. Catherine stepped out onto the veranda, her heart hammering. 6 riders approached, the lead horse carrying Jacob Thornhill himself. He dismounted with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed the world belonged to him. Mrs. Beaumont, he said, tipping his hat just enough to mock courtesy. Forgive the intrusion, but I come with lawful authority. Behind him, the county constable dismounted, a thin man named Garrett, whose badge gleamed dull in the fading light. Authority for what? Catherine asked, her voice sharp. Thornhill withdrew a folded paper from his coat, a petition from the Charleston court. It claims that the man known as Caleb, currently residing on your estate, was manumitted under false pretenses. Until this is resolved, he is to be remanded into custody. Catherine's blood ran cold. On what grounds? Thornhill smiled thinly. On the grounds that a woman alone cannot be trusted to maintain proper discipline over her property or her affections. The word times, affections times landed like a slap. Those are lies, she said. Caleb's papers are in perfect order. He's done nothing wrong. And yet, Thornhill said, rumors of impropriety have reached respectable ears. Whose? She demanded. Multiple sources. Thornhill replied, feigning pity. Your own servants, perhaps. Neighbors concerned for your reputation. You understand, I'm sure. The preservation of moral order is everyone's duty. The constable stepped forward uneasily. Mrs. Beaumont, please, make this easy. If the man's papers are sound, he'll be freed again in due time. Catherine's hands clenched at her sides. You mean after you destroy them? Thornhill's smile didn't falter. Where is he? Catherine stared at him, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. I don't know. Thornhill's eyes narrowed. Search the house. The men moved like a pack of dogs, their boots pounding up the stairs, their voices echoing through the halls. Catherine stood motionless on the veranda, listening to the breaking of her own life. Furniture overturned, doors slammed, drawers were emptied, books ripped open. 10 minutes later, the sound came a shout from the back of the house. Got him. They dragged Caleb out through the side yard, his hands bound with rope, his face expressionless. He didn't resist. The constable stepped back as Thornhill strutted forward. Mr. Caleb, Thornhill said smoothly, you are hereby detained pending review of your freedom papers. Caleb met his eyes. And if they're valid? Thornhill's smile widened. Then you have nothing to fear. Catherine felt the heat rise in her chest, fury and terror colliding. You'll regret this, she said. Every one of you. Thornhill turned to her, voice oily. Mrs. Beaumont, I strongly suggest you mind your tone. You are, after all, still a lady of society. For now. He mounted his horse. Take him. As the riders disappeared down the road, the dust they left behind hung in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Catherine remained on the veranda until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then she went inside, locked the door, and finally let herself fall to her knees. The rain began again, soft at first, tapping against the shutters. Somewhere in the house, the wind moved through the open rooms, whispering over the overturned chairs, lifting the loose pages of her letters that spoke of crops and weather and friendship, but beneath their polite language hid something far more dangerous. She would have to burn them all, because in Charleston, even paper could hang you. The night that followed Caleb's arrest stretched on without mercy. Catherine did not sleep. The house, once a place of soft murmurs and ordered quiet, had turned into a tomb. The servants moved in silence, terrified, waiting for the next knock, the next accusation. The lamps burned low. Shadows climbed the walls like guilt. She sat at her writing desk long after midnight, quill trembling in her hand. Before her lay 3 sheets of parchment letters, each addressed to a different name: Jonathan Pembroke, Eleanor Ashford, Lydia Crane. The ink ran thin where tears had fallen and been brushed away. "Is greater than, he saved me once," she wrote to Pembroke. "Now he is in chains for it. I will not let him vanish as Samuel did. If there is still any law left in this country that can recognize decency, I beg you find it." To Eleanor she wrote, "Is greater than, you told Margaret that mercy would destroy us. You were right, but only because we let them decide that mercy was sin. If you still have power in Charleston, use it. I no longer care what they think of me." And to Lydia, "Is greater than, you always said survival mattered more than truth. But what is survival, Lydia, if all it buys us is the privilege to watch good men die?" When she was done, she sealed the letters with wax and pressed her ring into it. Then she rang for her coachman. "Deliver these before dawn," she said. The old man hesitated. "To Charleston, ma'am? That's a long ride at night." "Then start now." Her voice was steady. "And tell no one." 20 miles south, at Plantation, Eleanor Ashford woke to the sound of hooves. She pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders and descended the stairs to find Isaiah waiting in the entryway, lantern in hand. "Message from Harrow Hill," he said, offering the sealed letter. Eleanor broke the wax. As she read, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Catherine's words burned hotter than the candle beside her. "She's going to get herself destroyed," Eleanor muttered. Isaiah stood silently, but his eyes, steady, intelligent, met hers with quiet reproach. "Ma'am," he said, "maybe she's already decided that's better than living afraid." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "You think she's right?" "I think," Isaiah said carefully, "that fear was never freedom, not for her, not for you." For a moment, Eleanor saw in him what Margaret must have seen in Samuel: dignity unbent by circumstance, courage that refused to apologize, and she hated herself for recognizing it. She turned away, pretending to study the letter again. "Get the carriage ready," she said. "We're going to Willowmere." Lydia Crane was awake before dawn when the carriage arrived. She met Eleanor in her parlor, the smell of coffee thick in the air. "She's in trouble," Eleanor said without preamble, handing over Catherine's letter. Lydia read in silence, her brow furrowing. When she finished, she set it down gently. "They've taken him," Eleanor nodded. "To Charleston, probably the same jail where Samuel's being held. If they rule his papers invalid, he'll be sold within a fortnight." Lydia poured a second cup of coffee, her movements deliberate. "And you came here because—" "Because she's right," Eleanor said. "We all did nothing when it was Margaret. I won't stand by again." Lydia studied her over the rim of her cup. "You're still afraid?" "Of course, I'm afraid," Eleanor snapped, "but I'm tired of being ruled by it." Lydia smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it's time the widows of Charleston stopped pretending to be helpless." She rose, moving toward the window. The morning light had begun to break through the mist, painting the fields in dull silver. "We'll go to the city, all of us. If they mean to make another example, let them see our faces." Eleanor blinked. "You're serious?" "I am," Lydia said, her voice calm. "Margaret died alone because we let her. I don't intend to make that mistake twice." 2 days later, Charleston's courthouse saw a spectacle no one had expected. 3 carriages arrived at the same hour, rolling up to the steps side by side. From them descended Eleanor Ashford, Catherine Beaumont, and Lydia Crane, widows of standing, dressed in severe black, veils lifted. A crowd gathered instantly, murmuring in disbelief. No one could recall when women of their rank had presented themselves voluntarily before the court. Rumor rippled like wind through wheat. Asterisk, the widows are back. The scandal rises again. Asterisk. Inside, the courtroom was already full. Judge Caldwell presided, looking weary but alert. Whitmore, still triumphant from the Langdon verdict, was present again, his expression tightening as he saw the 3 women enter together. Catherine took her seat beside Jonathan Pembroke, who stood to announce, "Your Honor, we are here to contest the unlawful detention of the freedman known as Caleb. His manumission was properly filed, witnessed, and recorded. The state has no legal grounds to void it." Whitmore rose smoothly. "And yet," he said, We have reason to believe Mrs. Beaumont was not of sound mind when granting said manumission compromised, perhaps by the same influences that afflicted the late Mrs. Langdon. Gasps and whispers surged through the gallery. Judge Caldwell struck his gavel once. Enough, we will hear testimony. Lydia Crane was called first. She moved to the stand with measured grace, her black gown whispering across the floor. When she sat, the courtroom stilled. Mrs. Crane, Pembroke said, you testified at Mrs. Langdon's hearing that you barely knew her. Was that the truth? Lydia looked out across the room, her gaze resting for a moment on Whitmore's smug face. No, she said. The silence that followed was complete. I lied, she continued. I lied because I was afraid of men like Mr. Whitmore, and of what happens to women who forget their place. Judge Caldwell's expression remained unreadable. And why tell the truth now? Because fear has bought us nothing, Lydia said quietly. Margaret was not mad. She was the only one among us who was sane. She saw the humanity in those the world calls property, and for that you buried her reputation. You called mercy, corruption, and compassion sin. Whitmore leapt to his feet. Your Honor, this is... Sit down, Mr. Whitmore, Caldwell said sharply. Lydia's voice strengthened. You ask whether a woman's judgment can be trusted when she acts with kindness. I say that a society which punishes kindness is the one unfit to judge. Margaret freed a man and left him what she no longer needed, dignity. If that is madness, then we are all insane for believing slavery is order. The room erupted. Half the gallery shouted approval, the other half spat curses. Judge Caldwell hammered his gavel again and again. When silence finally returned, Lydia met Eleanor's eyes. Your turn, she said softly. Eleanor stood. The air thickened. Mrs. Ashford, Pembroke said, you supported the court's prior ruling against Mrs. Langdon. Do you still? Eleanor hesitated only a moment. No, I was wrong. A murmur rippled through the hall. I testified against my friend, she continued, because I feared for my daughter, my plantation, my reputation. But I have learned that reputation cannot protect the soul. I see now what Margaret meant when she said mercy is the last form of rebellion left to women like us. Whitmore looked livid. And do you mean to say, Mrs. Ashford, that you too have improper times associations with your laborers? Eleanor's eyes flashed. Improper? The only improper thing I have done is remain silent, while men like you destroyed the only people in this land still capable of compassion. Whitmore sputtered. You admit to emotional entanglement. I admit, Eleanor said coldly, that I have learnt more about honor from the men you call slaves than from any man who ever called himself a gentleman. Gasps again. The old world cracked a little that day. And then Catherine rose, pale and trembling but unbroken. If you mean to put me on trial, she said, then let it be openly. I freed Caleb because he earned it, because he kept this land alive when I could not. I freed him because I saw the truth Margaret died for, that humanity cannot be owned. She looked to the judge. If that makes me unfit to hold property, then so be it. Let them take it all, but I will not call decency a crime. Even Judge Caldwell's stony face softened. He leaned forward, his hands clasped. Mrs. Beaumont, you understand the consequences of such defiance. I understand, she said, and I am done pretending not to. The judge nodded slowly. Then let the record show your courage. It may yet matter. Outside, thunder rumbled again, not from the sky, but from the crowd gathering on the courthouse steps, sensing that something was changing, something larger than one man's fate. The courthouse held its breath. Every soul inside, planter, clerk, slave, widow, felt the moment bend beneath the weight of what had just been said. For the first time in Charleston's memory, white women of rank had stood before the law and declared it unjust. The air felt charged, dangerous, almost holy. Jonathan Pembroke saw the shift and seized it. He rose, his voice calm but resonant. Your Honor, if the court believes these women weak, hysterical, or unsound, then let that be its official decree. But if the court still recognizes reason when it hears it, then we must face a simple fact. The law itself cannot condemn freedom without condemning the very foundation of justice. He turned toward the benches where Caleb sat in chains. This man's papers are valid. His conduct has been exemplary. The only charge against him is that his freedom offends the comfort of those who depend upon his bondage. That is not law, it is fear given power. A stir rippled through the gallery. Some planters shouted, "Treason!" while others sat silent, their certainty cracking like old paint. Judge Caldwell struck the gavel once. "The court will hear no further speeches. Call the final witness." Pembroke nodded. "The defense calls." Caleb. Gasps broke out again. Caleb rose slowly, his chains clinking softly against the wooden floor. He walked to the stand with measured grace, head high. The courtroom seemed to shrink around him. Even the rain outside had stilled. "State your name," the clerk said. "Caleb," he answered. "That's all I ever been called." Pembroke stepped forward. "Caleb, tell this court how you came to work at Harrow Hill." "I was sold here when I was 12, Caleb said evenly. "Mrs. Beaumont's husband owned me then. When he died, she kept me on. I worked the fields, then the irrigation, then the ledgers. She taught me numbers proper. When the floods came 2 summers ago, I was the one who saved the crop. After that, she made me foreman. When she freed me, it wasn't out of pity, it was payment." Pembroke nodded. "Did you ever use influence, persuasion, deceit to gain advantage over Mrs. Beaumont?" Caleb's eyes flickered toward Catherine. "No, sir. I gave her counsel when she asked it. That's all." "Do you love her?" The question fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Caleb's throat worked. He did not look away from Catherine. "I respect her," he said quietly. "I care for her safety, for her soul. If that's love, then yes. But love ain't what you think it is. It ain't weakness or sin. It's knowing someone's humanity and refusing to pretend you don't." The courtroom erupted, some with laughter, others with shock. Whitmore leapt to his feet, voice dripping with contempt. "You hear him. The arrogance, the audacity of a freedman to speak of love for a lady of breeding." Caldwell's gavel cracked the desk. "Order!" Whitmore advanced, his eyes gleaming. "Tell me, Caleb, how many times did you enter the mistress's chambers?" Pembroke shot up. "Objection. Sustained," Caldwell thundered. "Mr. Whitmore, you will conduct yourself with decency." Whitmore's lips curled. "Decency, Your Honor. Decency is what we're here to preserve." Caldwell's gaze turned icy. "You're here to preserve the law. Continue within its bounds." Whitmore's smile faltered. He paced once before the witness stand, then said, "You admit she freed you. You admit you remained on her land, and you admit you care for her. Tell me then, who truly holds authority on Harrow Hill, the mistress or her servant?" Caleb met his stare without flinching. "Authority ain't the same as worth. She leads. I work. We both bleed. The difference is in how you choose to see it." Laughter bubbled up from the back of the gallery, nervous and cruel. But something in Caleb's calm defiance unsettled them. Whitmore leaned in. "Do you believe yourself equal to her?" A pause. Then, clearly, "Yes." The word rang out like a bell. Pandemonium followed. Shouts, curses, prayers. Catherine's hands tightened on the table until her knuckles went white. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Lydia smiled faintly, a quiet, fearless smile. Judge Caldwell rose, pounding the gavel until the sound became almost violent. "Enough." When the noise finally faded, he looked at Caleb long and hard. "You have said dangerous things in this room, sir." Caleb nodded. "So did the truth once." The silence that followed was unbearable. Caldwell sat heavily, staring down at his papers. For the first time in his long tenure, the law felt small, inadequate, a weapon too blunt for the wound it had made. "The court will recess," he said finally, voice hoarse. "We reconvene tomorrow for judgment." The bailiff led Caleb away. The crowd surged, shouting and hissing. Catherine tried to rise, but Eleanor caught her arm. "Don't," she whispered. "They'll turn on you next." As the widows were escorted from the courtroom under escort, Whitmore's voice followed them like a curse. "You've doomed yourselves, ladies. The world won't remember your mercy, only your disgrace." Lydia turned once at the door. Her eyes, calm and razor-sharp, met his. "Then let disgrace be remembered," she said. "It's better than forgetting who we are." That night, the city trembled. Rumors raced through Charleston streets faster than the rain. Asterisk. The widows confessed to loving their slaves. Asterisk. Asterisk. The judge lost his temper. Asterisk. Asterisk. The freedman called himself equal. Asterisk. In taverns and parlors, men debated whether the world was ending. In the quarters by the river, the enslaved whispered a different rumor, one of hope. Inside his cell, Caleb sat awake. The candle had burned low, its light trembling against the damp stone. From somewhere down the corridor came a low, steady voice, an old man singing a hymn, too soft to name. The door creaked, a shadow stepped inside. Jonathan Pembroke. He looked exhausted, his spectacles fogged from the rain. "They'll demand a harsher verdict tomorrow," he said quietly. "The planters are furious. They want you gone to make an example." Caleb nodded. "I figured. I can try to appeal," Pembroke said, "but it may not matter. If Caldwell yields to pressure, the papers will be voided." Caleb looked up, calm even now. "Then it's not just my freedom on trial, it's theirs too." Pembroke hesitated. "The widows." "All of them," Caleb said. "They stood today. First time anyone's ever stood for us. That's what scares these men most." Pembroke exhaled. "You're not wrong." Caleb smiled faintly. "Then let 'em be scared." The lawyer stared at him for a long time, seeing not just courage but clarity, the same kind he'd seen once before in Margaret Langdon's eyes when she signed that will. "Get some rest," Pembroke said at last. "Tomorrow, the fight begins again." But neither of them slept, because both knew that, come morning, Charleston would no longer be the same. The morning broke over Charleston, heavy and silent, as if even the sun hesitated to rise upon what was coming. By 8 o'clock, the courthouse square was already packed, planters in their best coats, women in veils whispering behind fans, and in the back rows, dozens of freedmen and enslaved workers who had risked their master's wrath just to witness the verdict. Word had spread like wildfire through the Low Country. Asterisk, asterisk, the judge will decide if a black man can truly be free. Asterisk, asterisk, the air crackled with something more than humidity. It was history trying to breathe. Judge Caldwell entered at 9 sharp. His face was drawn, his robe darker than usual, as though he knew the burden of what his words would carry. He took his seat, cleared his throat, and surveyed the courtroom. "Bring in the prisoner." The bailiff opened the side door. Caleb stepped through, unshackled for the first time since his arrest. He walked slowly, head high, and when his eyes met Catherine's across the room, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade. She gave the faintest nod, a signal of faith, or perhaps farewell. Caldwell's voice broke the silence. "This court has deliberated upon the matter of the freedman known as Caleb, formerly of Harrow Hill Plantation, and upon the petition contesting his manumission." He paused. The entire room leaned forward. "I have considered the testimony presented," he continued, "the documents provided, and the precedents few, though they are of South Carolina law. The statute recognizes the right of a property owner to manumit, provided the act is witnessed and registered. By that measure, Mrs. Beaumont's actions were lawful." A murmur spread through the crowd, hope and disbelief mingled. Whitmore was on his feet instantly. "Your Honor, this undermines the entire social..." Caldwell's gavel cracked like thunder. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." The old judge turned back to the chamber. His voice softened but did not waver. "I have served this bench for 30 years. I have upheld laws I did not write and delivered judgments I did not always believe were just. But I cannot and will not pretend that justice exists in a world that condemns compassion as corruption." He turned to Caleb. "Your manumission papers are valid. You are by law a free man. The petition to void them is dismissed." A gasp rolled through the room, followed by shouting, protests, cries of disbelief. Planters leapt to their feet, shaking their fists. Women fainted. A man in the back spat on the floor and stormed out. But in the chaos, a sound rose above the noise, a single voice, trembling but fierce. It was Lydia Crane. "Let it be written," she called, "that a court of Charleston has for once chosen justice over fear." The gallery roared, some in fury, others in tears. Caldwell's gavel hammered again. "Order." The noise died, but the change did not. The air had shifted permanently. However, Caldwell continued, "This court strongly advises Mrs. Beaumont to relocate her affairs and reconsider her household arrangements. The law may protect freedom, but it cannot protect reputation. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell one final time. Outside, the mob waited. The widows exited first, their carriages surrounded by guards. Catherine kept her veil low, but she could hear the jeers. "Whore of Harrow Hill," someone shouted. "Negro lover." Others spat at the horses. Eleanor gripped her hand through the window. "Don't look at them," she whispered. "They'll eat your fear." But Catherine wasn't afraid anymore. Not after what she'd seen in that courtroom, the moment when truth had stood its ground and refused to kneel. She turned her face to the crowd and said, loud enough for those nearest to hear, "You can burn the land, but you cannot bury the truth." The shouts faltered. Even Whitmore, standing on the courthouse steps, looked shaken. 3 months later, Harrow Hill was gone. Catherine sold the estate quietly, using the proceeds to settle debts and pay wages to those who stayed until the end. Then, under cover of dawn, she left Charleston in a hired wagon, heading north. Some said she reached Philadelphia. Others swore they'd seen her in Massachusetts, running a small farm beside a man named Caleb, who built houses for freedmen newly arrived from the South. No one knew for sure. Catherine Beaumont's name disappeared from Charleston society records within a year. To the world, she was a ghost, another fallen woman, swallowed by scandal. But in the black quarters along the river, the story lived on. They said the Lady of Harrow Hill had walked away from her inheritance and chosen humanity instead. They said she had vanished into freedom. Eleanor Ashford remained at Belmy. Her daughter Abigail took over the ledgers, hiring laborers on contract instead of through the slave auction. Eleanor endured ridicule from the neighbors, financial ruin from boycotts, and late-night threats carved into her gateposts. Yet she never yielded. When asked why she kept paying wages to those who worked her land, she would answer simply, "Because I sleep better." Isaiah stayed by her side until his death in 1799. His grave lay under the oak near the river, the first on her property, marked with both a first and last name. Lydia Crane lived long enough to see what none of them had dared imagine. In 1791, she rewrote her will. It left everything she owned, house, land, tools, and savings to her foreman, Josiah, for services rendered and friendship beyond measure. The family contested it, of course, but Judge Caldwell, citing precedent, upheld it. His ruling became known quietly among abolitionist circles as Times, the Crane decision. Lydia passed 2 years later in her sleep, a faint smile on her lips. And Samuel? He never returned to Charleston. With Pembroke's help, he traveled north, settling in Pennsylvania, where no bounty hunters dared follow. He built furniture in a small workshop on Market Street, known to his neighbors as a man of few words but infinite patience. In 1802, a small book appeared in Philadelphia under the title Times, Recollections of a Freedman. The author was anonymous, but those who had known Samuel recognized the cadence in its words. Near the end of the final chapter, he wrote, "Is greater than, she saw me when others looked through me. She spoke to me when others commanded. She gave me not just freedom, but the right to call myself a man. Is greater than." They called her mad for it. Is greater than. They destroyed her name, denied her memory, and buried her beneath their fear. Is greater than, but I remember. Is greater than mercy, is not madness. Is greater than compassion, is not crime. Is greater than the world that punished her, is the one that needs saving. The book was quietly banned in South Carolina but circulated widely in the North, passed hand to hand among abolitionists who read it in secret and wept. Years later, long after Judge Caldwell's gavel had turned to dust and Whitmore's name had faded from court records, a traveler from Charleston passed through Philadelphia. In a small church graveyard on the outskirts of the city, he noticed a modest headstone, unremarkable except for the words carved upon it, "Margaret Langdon, beloved, free at last." Beside it, 2 smaller stones stood, one inscribed, Samuel, the other, Catherine, No one knew who had placed them there or when. But every spring, fresh magnolia blossoms appeared upon those graves, white as forgiveness. And thus, what began as a scandal became a whisper, carried by generations, the story of a woman who defied her world, a man who refused to kneel, and a handful of others who learned, too late perhaps, that conscience cannot be chained. History would not record their names in textbooks or sermons, but in the long memory of the South, they endured in songs, in rumors, in the way an old woman might pause at dusk and murmur, "Mercy is not madness." For that, Margaret Langdon's legacy lived on.